The fact of the matter is, dissatisfaction towards the People's Republic of China is both popular and bipartisan in the US. There has been a collapse in support across the board, and even some of China's traditional supporters in Washington have been alienated. And most of this change has been building up over several years, accelerating in the last 12 months in response to Chinese state behavior. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. Wherever you are, I hope you're doing well. It's good to see you guys again. It has been a bit of a busy week. This episode, we're going to do a couple of quick mini updates right at the beginning of the episode. We're going to look at diplomatic and military updates, but just quick mini updates looking at the basic facts of it. Then we have a couple of big deep dives that we're going to do this week. In the first few, we're going to be looking at major speeches that General Secretary Xi Jinping has made at two important symposiums, one in Anhui and another in Beijing, the capital. We're going to look at what this means for some of the new policy directions that the party may be introducing over the next 6 to 18 months. Then we're going to do a big deep dive into what the hell is this dual circulation economic model that the party, and specifically General Secretary Xi Jinping, has been promoting since May in response to the economic smash that is basically the pandemic, the double blow of the pandemic domestically and then the external economic environment due to the pandemic. So we're going to be looking at dual circulation. What exactly is this new economic model, and what will it mean for China going forward? What will it mean for the next 5-year plan, which begins next year, as well as some of the other, frankly, statist policies that seem to be coming out of Zhongnanhai in Beijing. Then we're also doing another deep dive looking at the China-US relationship again. There has been plenty of material on the US side. We're going to look at policymakers in Beijing. What the hell are they thinking? Why are they adopting the language and the actions that they are adopting at this particular time? The worst time in the US-China relationship since it formally began in 1979. And then finally, we're going to look at Wang Yi, the Minister of Finance, and his special trip to Europe this week. He's had a couple of major visits, and he's going to be followed by the top dog in terms of foreign policy, Yang Jiechi, the director of the Foreign Policy Office of the CCP, next week. So we're going to be talking about all of that in this episode of China Update. Now, before we start, of course, it's always a massive help if you smash that like button. Unfortunately, YouTube does not like discussing China at the moment. I don't know why. It may be tied up with US politics at the moment. I don't know, but I've been told that it will not promote this content. So the best thing you can do is hit that like button, and it is a huge help. It tells the algorithm that this is legitimate content, even though it's coming out of China, and it puts a dent in the barrier of discussing this subject matter. And of course, I'm also going to put a link below to my Patreon for anyone who wants to help support me and try and keep this channel 100% fan supported. A huge thank you to recent signups, Andrew and Mike and Ewan, and of course Nathan. Thank you so much, guys, for your support. It's a massive help. Now, with all that said, let's jump into this week's China Update. On Wednesday, the People's Liberation Army test-fired two so-called aircraft carrier killer missiles in what analysts are calling a, quote, warning to the United States, end quote. The DF-26B, which boasts a range of 4,000 kilometers, which is approximately 2,500 miles, and can be used in nuclear or conventional strikes against ground and naval targets, was launched from deep within the interior of the People's Republic of China in the northwestern province of Qinghai, which sort of laps over the Tibetan Plateau to some extent, and the Gobi Desert to the north. The other, the DF-21D, with a range of about 1,800 kilometers, was fired from the coastal province of Zhejiang. We have cities like Hangzhou, for example, the provincial capital, and of course Hugs, the major cosmopolitan city, Shanghai. Also on Wednesday, US State and Commerce Departments unveiled a set of visa and export restrictions targeting Chinese state-owned companies and their leadership, executives, etc., involved in China's territorial claims in the contested South China Sea. Of the various state-owned enterprises targeted, units of China Communications Construction Co., a massive contractor heavily involved in the Belt and Road Initiative and many of its projects, was hit. US officials have called this particular SOE the, quote, Huawei of infrastructure, end quote. People's Republic of China Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian responded to the move by saying, quote, China's relevant constructions on its own territory are completely within the scope of its sovereignty and have nothing to do with militarization, end quote. And quote, it is reasonable, legal, and beyond dispute for Chinese companies and individuals to participate in construction in their own country, end quote. Washington will add 24 Chinese companies involved in South China Sea dredging to the list that restricts US companies from supplying US origin technology to them. On Tuesday, US Democratic nominee for President Joe Biden's campaign formally labeled the situation in Xinjiang as genocide, saying, quote, the unspeakable oppression that Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities have suffered at the hands of China's authoritarian government is genocide, and Joe Biden stands against it in the strongest terms, end quote. US media reports this week also that the Trump administration is also considering taking the same position. The next day, state-run Global Times responded with saying, quote, genocide is a very serious crime. The United Nations has a clear definition of it, which has nothing to do with the situation in Xinjiang. Ethnic minorities in China have enjoyed protection and preferential treatment, end quote. As I have said in a previous episode, if accusations of systemic, large-scale forced sterilizations prove to be accurate, this may well meet the definition of genocide as per the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Article 2, Section D. On Wednesday, China's Deputy Ambassador to Canberra, Australia, Wang Xining, gave a controversial and closely followed by Australian media speech on the current state of the China-Australia relationship. In response to questions, Wang held that treacherous Australia had betrayed China by calling for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, and that China has always represented Australia and expected the same in return. Perhaps Wang's most cutting comment, however, was, quote, I don't see any reason for whining about your constitutional fragility and intellectual vulnerability, end quote. Chinese state media focused more on different parts of Wang's speech, however, like saying China promoted, quote, progressive thinking and inclusive society, end quote, which Australia was undermining. In language that we have seen in relation to China's current poor relations with other nations, whether it be Canada, India, Japan, or as we shall see later in this video, the United States, the Chinese Deputy Ambassador concluded that Australia alone was fully responsible for the current state of Australia-China relations. Okay guys, those are the mini updates out of the way. Let's look at the main meal and jump into some of our deep dive topics this week on China Update. Xi Jinping chaired a symposium on the final day of his Anhui inspection tour held in Hefei, Anhui's provincial capital. We touched on this Anhui tour on last week's episode. State-run Xinhua reports, quote, Xi urged the Delta region to take the lead in forming a new development pattern that takes the domestic economy as the mainstay and allows the domestic and foreign markets to boost each other, end quote. So what does this mean? Well, whenever we see this type of language that I just used, this is the media in China referring to Xi Jinping's new development model, the so-called dual circulations model. The media is calling this a 新发展格局, or a new development structure. From the speech that Xi Jinping gave in this first symposium in Anhui, there's a few points that are worth touching on here. In the speech, the Delta region has been expanded to include Anhui, and Xi gave this speech in Anhui. The Yangtze region typically refers to the area dominated by all dialect speakers in parts of Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and of course Shanghai. Anhui is a poor province that hugs these other dialect-dominated areas, traditionally referred to as the Yangtze Delta, and it often supplies a lot of cheap labor to some of the more developed and higher tier cities in this wealthier Delta region. Its inclusion, Anhui's inclusion in the language here from Xi Jinping at this symposium is interesting. It may signal to China's interior that the party wants to support the poorer interior of Han Chinese China more, or perhaps increase the consumption for greater growth in these historically poorer regions, and that this dual circulation will achieve that. Whether or not it actually will, of course, is a different question. This dynamic is very interesting in Chinese politics, and if you're a Chinese politics nerd like I am, you'll know that there's always been this tension between the rich coastal cities and the poor interior, and the politicians, officials from each of these camps have wrestled over policy depending on where they're from. Anyway, let's continue. General Secretary Xi Jinping, quote, urged the provinces of Jiangsu, Anhui, and Zhejiang, as well as Shanghai, to prioritize key areas and major fields, including integrated circuit, biomedicine, artificial intelligence, and called for efforts to foster the innovative development of micro, small, and medium-sized technology companies to deliver more fruitful outcomes, and plans for the integrated development of the Yangtze River Delta during the 14th five-year plan period, 2021 to 2025, should be drawn up in a practical way. So we can see here that Xi Jinping is signaling that the Yangtze River Delta will tie into the dual circulation plan, which we're going to get onto in a minute. I know you're thinking, what the hell is the dual circulation plan? But I've been thinking the same for like 2 months, trust me. But we're going to get there in about 5 minutes. As well as the next five-year plan, which is set to begin next year. And like I've been telling you guys, we will know more details about the five-year plan with the 5th plenum, which is going to be held in 2 months' time. I also think that Xi Jinping's pet project, the very controversial Xining new development city currently being built in the south of, or to the south of Beijing, the capital, should also play a major part in the next five-year plan. Now, the second major symposium that General Secretary Xi Jinping was involved in was a economic and social work symposium in the capital, Beijing. A few days later, speaking at an economic symposium with economists and scholars in Beijing, General Secretary Xi Jinping gave more details about his new dual circulation development model, as well as the next five-year plan. He called the model a, quote, strategic choice to reshape China's strengths in international cooperation and competition, end quote, and that, quote, China will continue with supply-side structural reform and further boost domestic demand. And went on to say production, distribution, circulation, and consumption will rely more on the domestic market, end quote. Interestingly, he also said, quote, the current level of innovation is unsuited to China's needs, end quote, putting this problem ahead of income inequality and social security, think here police, that sort of security, stability, in importance, and that China needs to, quote, use technological innovation to induce development, end quote. This could be signaling that he wants another push for a high-end manufacturing growth model, think Germany, as opposed to trying to expand services for the domestic market, think USA, and to leverage China's large market to attract and absorb foreign advanced technology. She also took this opportunity to reinforce the role that Marxism should play in China, saying officials should use Marxism to help the Chinese economy. We discussed this trend back to Marxism, this reversal back to Marxism from Xi Jinping's speeches in last week's episode. He also said something that I haven't heard before. He said, 越开放越重视安全, which means the more we open up, as in China opening up to the world, the more we need to be concerned with our security. Like I said, I haven't actually heard that language before. If someone else has seen that in a major speech that he's made over the last 12 months, I would be interested. But that language is particularly interesting given the trends we're seeing at the moment. Now, while we are here, I think it is worth really looking at this dual circulation idea, strategy, model, whatever the hell it is, because it has been pushed by Xi Jinping and others very heavily since May, and it does look like it is going to be a big policy push for the economy in China going forward. And so we need to try and get an idea of what the hell this all means. Chinese and Western economists have been arguing about this very question, though. And so let's talk about one particular view from a highly respected economist here. So China economy specialist, financial professor at Peking University, senior fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center, which is also in Beijing, and someone that I take very seriously on questions of the Chinese economy, Michael Pettis, wrote an excellent piece for the Financial Times this week where he discussed his views on this new dual circulation, dual, that's your pronunciation, dual circulation strategy that we have been talking about these last few weeks. I want to quote parts of this essay that he wrote in length, but I have shortened a lot of it for brevity's sake. I would highly recommend reading the entire article. I'm going to leave a link below. It is not that long. You should be able to get through it in 5 to 10 minutes max. It's well worth the read. Let's look at some of his main points here, however. Quote, analysts who follow the Chinese economy have been struggling to understand exactly what the Chinese leadership has committed to. And it seems that Beijing's new economic strategy calls for the country to continue to expand domestic production for exports, international circulation, while shifting the economy towards a greater relative emphasis on production for domestic consumption, internal circulation. And goes on to say, in principle, this makes sense. Once it had closed the underlying gap between desired investment and actual investment, which it probably did in the early 2000s, China needed to base growth on domestic demand driven by rising wages, rather than depending on exports or on increasingly non-productive investment. Because China has relied so much on the latter, its debt burden has soared to one of the highest in the world, and went on to say, but while dual circulation is presented as a new strategy, it really isn't. Beijing has been promising something similar since at least 2007, and this didn't happen. The consumption share of Chinese GDP remains extraordinarily low, just 2 percentage points higher in 2019 than it was in 2007. He went on to say, it will get worse this year, and the consumption share of GDP will decline in 2020 to erase most of the gains it made since its low point a decade ago. And went on to say debt will rise an astonishing 16 to 20 percentage points in 2020. Now he goes on to say that Beijing urgently needs to boost sustainable domestic demand, something that I have been screaming about like a wild man on here since we first started doing this channel together over a year ago. But he identifies 2 problems for Beijing that he believes many seriously underestimate. The first is rebalancing towards domestic consumption will require incredible, quote, economic, social, and political transformation. He says, quote, to rebalance demand towards consumption means nothing less than a major rebalancing of income towards ordinary households. For Chinese consumption to be broadly in line with that of other developing countries, ordinary households must recover at least 10 to 15 percentage points of GDP at the expense of business, the wealthy, or the government. This rebalancing involves a major shift of wealth and with it political power to ordinary people. This will not be easy, end quote. Now, the second problem he identifies is an internal contradiction in this dual circulation model. That is that the policy that's needed to sustainably increase domestic consumption would reduce export competitiveness, hurting one of the 2 circulations, saying, quote, here's the problem. China can only rely on domestic consumption to drive a much greater share of growth if workers begin to receive a much higher share of what they produce. So the very process of rebalancing must undermine China's export competitiveness, end quote. Now, Pettis concludes his essay by saying, quote, the sustainable growth Chinese policymakers want still requires a major transformation in the way income is distributed to different sectors. The transformation to a new model will almost certainly require a very difficult adjustment period. For dual circulation to work, internal circulation can only come at the expense of international circulation. And as this happens, wealth, and with it power, must be shifted from today's elites to ordinary Chinese households. End quote. I largely agree with the analysis of Professor Pettis. However, I believe that there isn't currently the political will in Beijing to pass the type of reforms needed to achieve this rebalancing, in large part because of the dominance of more statist-leaning policymakers currently over other cliques in Beijing policymaking circles at this point in time. My concern is what is more likely to happen if this rebalancing is actually seriously attempted at all, is that once growth drops to politically unacceptable levels, officials will pull back and turn back to the old playbook to maintain growth, further entrenching its current structural issues. Some officials in Beijing may indeed be increasingly concerned with the state of the China-US relationship, and they should be. It is indeed the worst that it has been since official relations began in 1979. I think that there is now an effort to try and put a floor under the relationship to stop any further deterioration, even though they probably cannot improve things going forward at this point. China will need a stable external environment as it's in for a bumpy few years internally. However, Beijing's official position remains that the relationship, the current state of the relationship and the situation internationally is entirely the US's fault, and that Chinese behavior, state behavior over the last few years has been beyond reproach, which is not really a winning strategy, diplomatically speaking. Last week, China's ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai, gave a speech to the Brookings Institute. The language he used in that speech was very telling. Quote, "Today, the US-China relationship is going in the wrong direction, described by some as in free fall. Over the years, it has never been short of problems and difficulties, but alarmingly, there are attempts now to negate what has been built up so painstakingly by generations of Chinese and Americans over the decades, and to deliberately push our two countries into conflict and confrontation. People from all walks of life in China and the United States should stay guarded against vicious attempts to push the bilateral relationship to confrontation and conflict. We should firmly resist any resurgence of McCarthyism and expand two-way exchanges and cooperation so as to get the China-US relationship back to the right track as soon as possible." End quote. The language sounds very concerned here, but as we can see, Beijing is still not admitting to its own mistakes, which have contributed to the current state of the China-US relationship, as well as other poor relationships like with Australia, Canada, India, Japan, and others. To ensure that there is no confusion on the Chinese position on this point, People's Republic of China Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian on Tuesday made this position very clear at a press conference, saying, quote, "First, I must correct Pompeo on the very basis of his remarks. The US is entirely and solely responsible for the current difficulties in China-US relations." End quote. Nationalism at home has severely limited China's diplomatic space internationally, and with serious homegrown issues to deal with over the next few years, Beijing is unlikely to risk domestic political capital for diplomatic gains. But there is another component, I think. Like I said a few weeks ago, I believe many officials here, particularly in the middle management of the government, as it were, are only exposed to domestic state-run media narratives, and as such are tremendously misinformed about important regional and international policy challenges for China. This greatly increases the systemic risk of miscalculations. I believe a prime example of this was on display last year when key government decision makers in the mainland erroneously believed that the 2019 Hong Kong protests did not enjoy popular support locally, popular support on the ground, and I believe they were taken completely by surprise when pan-democratic and anti-establishment candidates won landslide victories in local elections. But moving back to the China-US relationship, I'll give you another example of a potential miscalculation. I am concerned when I see media blaming the current situation vis-a-vis the China-US relationship on a small group of anti-China forces in the United States, people which a recent state-run People's Daily commentary referred to as, quote, a slim number of swindlers and madmen, end quote. State-run Xinhua News identifies one of these madmen as US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, of whom Xinhua wrote in a piece this week, quote, Pompeo's baseless, fact-distorting speech misrepresents history and reality. It is full of ideological prejudice and driven by a Cold War mentality. His remarks have not only been condemned by the Chinese people, but also criticized and opposed by sensible people in the United States, as well as the international community. End quote. On Tuesday, state-run newspaper The People's Daily dedicated 3 full pages to criticizing the US Secretary of State, calling him a, quote, fascist and, quote, McCarthyist. That afternoon, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian told reporters that Pompeo, quote, must recognize and accept the reality that for the international community, including the United States, China is a positive force and an opportunity for global peace and prosperity rather than a negative factor or a threat, end quote. And concluded, quote, China will never allow him to confuse the public, end quote. Now, I don't know whether this small group of anti-China forces line is to give both sides, the US and China side, political room to maneuver domestically, or whether it is a signal, say, to the Biden camp that there is space to reset the relationship if he is elected president, or whether most Chinese officials and academics actually believe this. This concerns me because if they do believe that the current poor relationship is entirely solely the fault of the United States and is the result of a small group of anti-China forces influencing public policy in the United States, then the foreign policy establishment in Beijing is seriously misguided. The fact of the matter is, dissatisfaction towards the People's Republic of China is both popular and bipartisan in the US. There has been a collapse in support across the board, and even some of China's traditional supporters in Washington have been alienated. And most of this change has been building up over several years, accelerating in the last 12 months in response to Chinese state behavior. I think at this point, the only thing keeping the bilateral relationship intact is trade. Actually, in a rare piece of good news related to the China-US relationship this week, the US and Chinese lead trade negotiators, Robert Lighthizer and Liu He, had an important call, and both sides, quote, agreed to create conditions and atmosphere to continue pushing forward the implementation of the trade deal, end quote, according to the Chinese announcement, and with the US government saying, quote, both sides see progress and are committed to taking the steps necessary to ensure the success of the agreement, end quote. The following day, an authoritative publication in China reported, quote, China-US talks were smooth and harmonious, end quote. If Beijing does indeed want to stop further deterioration in the bilateral relationship, it should continue to buy US products under the Phase 1 trade agreement and offer a lot of carrots to Wall Street and corporate America. But I am pessimistic on this, guys. I think the relationship is going to get much, much worse. Okay, one more important story, and then that will be it for this week, guys. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi began a 5-nation tour of Europe on Tuesday. On Monday, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian said that Mr. Wang would visit Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, France, and Germany. He also identified Beijing's official purpose for the visit as, quote, through this visit, China hopes to achieve 3 goals. That the two sides will act on Chinese and European leaders' consensus and advance major political and economic agendas, deepen cooperation on fighting the virus and keeping the global industry and supply chains stable, and further discuss cooperation in emerging sectors like the digital economy, the green economy, send out messages of jointly upholding multilateralism and improving global governance, and contribute more to world peace, stability, and development, end quote. Very boilerplate stuff. On Tuesday, the goals of the visit grew by one, with the foreign minister himself saying his trip to Europe had four main purposes. One, to continue the fight against COVID-19 with Europe. Two, support Europe's unity and development. Three, promote China-Europe relations. And four, boost world peace and development. Some commentators, however, have pointed out that this is more or less a damage control mission to the EU after several months of diplomatic missteps, and to try and reverse the hardening US-EU joint transatlantic stance towards China, which has been developing over this time too. You guys might remember, for example, last year the EU labeled China a systemic rival. Germany remains the last large Western market where Huawei can still largely operate freely, though there is increasing pressure on Merkel's administration to change this. Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and China's handling of the pandemic in the initial few months are just some of the areas of concern for several European states. There has also been concern that China has been attempting to undermine the EU through bilateral commercial contracts with member nations like Greece, for example. Perhaps this is why Wang Yi diplomatically added, quote, supporting Europe's unity as a purpose of his trip on Tuesday. Politburo member Yang Jiechi, who is higher than Wang Yi, is expected to visit Greece, Spain, and maybe Portugal next week, in what is a very rare back-to-back visit for Chinese officials. Okay guys, thank you so much. That is our episode for this week. Leave your comments below. I always love to hear them. Make sure you like and share if you enjoyed the episode. It is a massive help. But at any rate, wherever you are, I hope you're staying safe and staying sane. And I will see you guys all next week on China Update.